Welcome to the TCA's Year 8 lesson about the suffragettes. You should have already completed a starter activity again as part of your team's live instruction. So let's make a start on the lesson. Remember to pause this video where I ask you to in order to complete the tasks. And also remember that your teachers are still online during the lesson on Teams to answer any questions that you have along the way. So please go back to them if you need any help. Okay, Year 8, so I'd like to start by writing down the title for this lesson, which is How Significant Were the Suffragettes? You may want to pause this slide for a second just while you get that down. So the last lesson we looked at the work of the suffragists and how they campaigned for women's rights to vote. The suffragists, remember, were peaceful in their methods. They used tactics like speeches, petitions and leaflets to raise awareness of the cause. Remember that these were all law-abiding methods. And remember that Millicent Fawcett did not believe in violent methods. She believed that these methods would just give ammunition to opposition groups, who would use this to argue that women were not suitable for political roles. For this part of the lesson, we're going to be looking into why the suffragettes turned to militancy. We know from last lesson that some women were angry because of the slow progress that was being made by the suffragists, but I would like you to find out more about this cause of the shift of tactics. First of all, I just want to turn your attention to the word militancy and what militancy is. There's a definition here if you want to write it down, but militancy is the use of confrontational or violent methods in support of a political or a social cause. So basically what that means is that the suffragettes used violence sometimes to get their voices heard. This task requires you to watch a video, and whilst you're watching the video, I'd like you to make notes about why the suffragettes turned to militancy in their fight for the vote. You'll also need to make sure that you write this above question as a subheading before you start making your notes from this video. Essentially, you need to watch the video carefully. It's just over 5 minutes long, and just make some notes from it. When you've finished this task, I'd like you to come back to this video and continue this lesson once you've finished the task. Now, you might be wondering again where you can find the YouTube video. The link is obviously on the slide, but you can't click on it. So you're going to need to click on the link that is attached to show my homework, or you can find the link in the description box on this YouTube video. So please use either of those links, it's the same one, and then as I said before, come back to me on this video once you've finished this task. I would now like you to write the next subheading as suffragettes, which is just here. So I'd like you to write that as the next subheading. And I would also like you to write down the definition for what a suffragette is. Now, a suffragette is a woman seeking the right to vote through organised and often more violent protest. Just like last lesson, we're going to find out more about the suffragettes through a comprehension task, where I will basically ask you to read the information on the slide and complete the questions on the slide in full sentences. Remember that this is important for when we look back at our notes in later lessons. And before you start, I'd just like to mention the images to the right. One shows Emmeline Pankhurst, leader of the suffragettes here. The other shows her statue, can be found in London. Now remember, Fawcett, Millicent Fawcett, the leader of the suffragists, has also been remembered in this way. This shows that both of these women are considered significant today for their efforts to gaining more equal rights for women in England. Now, as I would like to start the comprehension task, remember you will need to pause the slides as you go through the work. So, I would like to start this comprehension task by reading through the information on this slide and answering the first 3 questions that you can find at the bottom of the slide here. All of these answers can be found in the text above, so you don't need to look anywhere else. You should pause this video now to complete these questions before moving on to the next slide, which is where you'll continue your comprehension. Well done for completing the first 3 questions, Year 8, but you can now move on to reading the last bit of information about the suffragettes and complete the final 3 questions about them. Again, they're just located at the bottom of the slide here, and again, you can find all of the answers in the information above. Again, you're going to need to pause the video to complete your answers in full sentences, and once you've finished these final questions, go on to the next slide, and I'm going to go through the answers with you before we move on to anything else. Okay guys, I'm going to start by going through the answers for the comprehension questions here. Question 1 is nice and straightforward with what is the formal name for the suffragettes and who was their leader? So first of all, remember that the suffragettes were set up in 1903 after the suffragists, and they were officially called the Women's Social and Political Union, also known as WSPU. So if you see them referred to as that, they're also the suffragettes. And the question also asks who is their leader, and the WSPU were led by Emmeline Pankhurst. However, her daughters were also involved in the movement too. Question 2 asks, what did the suffragettes want? Well, essentially, they wanted women to be given the right to vote. And essentially, they were willing to use other methods of gaining that right, which would mean destroying things like property, anything other than a human life. It's important that we mention that the suffragettes used violent tactics, but they never really wanted to harm a human. Okay, they never purposely went out to hurt a human life. Instead, it was about targeting property, things that would get the attention of the government. Question 3 was, why did the suffragettes move away from peaceful protest? Now, to be fair, the answer is kind of in the first sentence of the second paragraph. It starts talking about how the suffragettes started off relatively peacefully, but they felt their methods were being ignored and that the progress for the cause was not moving fast enough. And so that's why they felt they needed to move away from peaceful protesting and move towards more aggressive protest. But there's also a bit of information here about something that kind of perhaps changed their attitude towards the government, and when the government, I suppose, left them with no alternative at this point. I'm just going to read through this information with you and talk a bit about what my thoughts are here. So it says that it was only in 1905 that the organisation created a stir in which Pankhurst and Kenny interrupted a political meeting in Manchester where they asked two politicians, Winston Churchill and Sir Edward Grey, if they believed that women should have the right to vote. Neither man replied. As a result, the two women got out a banner which had "Votes for Women" on it, and they shouted at the two politicians to answer their questions. Such actions were all but unheard of, when public speakers were usually heard in silence and listened to courteously, even if they did not agree with them. Pankhurst and Kenny were then thrown out of the meeting and arrested for causing an obstruction and assault to a police officer. They believe the assault was a spitting incident where they had basically, assaulted him in some way. Now you can see here that it kind of moves from more peaceful protest where the two women are starting by asking the politicians a question. It seems that as they are ignored and as even the banner and the shouting fails to get the attention and answers from the politicians, that seems to be when the violence breaks out. And it seems that it's the frustration and the lack of attention and answers that they're getting from the government that forces the women to feel that there's no alternative but to turn towards more violent protest. And that's probably one of the reasons why they did move away from more peaceful protesting. Okay, so we're just going to continue going through the remaining answers for your comprehension questions. So the first question I asked you was, what happened to Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenny? So first of all, both women basically were offered to pay a fine, but they refused. So you should really have got down for your answer that they chose to go to prison in preference to paying their fine. Now you might find this an odd choice, but it's basically to try and highlight the injustice of the system, show that a peaceful protest led to women being sent to prison. And at that point, it kind of gave Emmeline Pankhurst something to write about in her autobiography, where she talked about what was going wrong in England and how people were being punished quite heavily for peacefully protesting at times. Emmeline Pankhurst actually did talk about this in her book, where she mentions particularly that the suffragettes had previously interrupted a great many meetings and were then met with violence, and they were violently thrown out and insulted, and often assaulted by police officers. They were painfully bruised and hurt. I think what this tries to tell us is that the suffragettes were kind of sick of using peaceful protest and then being met by ignorance and violence, and instead they felt that violence could only be met with violence, and that basically it was time to use more aggressive protest. The fifth question is, what actions did the suffragettes take in their fight for the vote? Well, there's a number of things you should have written down for this. And remember that their actions were definitely very violent. Remember that they were never about targeting human life, but they were definitely about targeting any forms of, property, things that would get the attention of the upper class men or people in government in the country. So to give you a couple of examples, they burned down churches, such as the Church of England, which was against what they wanted. They vandalised shops on Oxford Street, so they broke their windows and things like that. They chained themselves to Buckingham Palace because the royal family was seen as being against women having the right to vote. hired out boats and they sailed up the Thames and shouted abuse through loud hailers at Parliament as it sat. And others refused to pay their taxes as a way of protesting too. This isn't everything. There were other examples like cutting telephone wires, blowing up post boxes and things like that to cut off communication between people in London, in particular in areas like that. Politicians were also attacked. If they went to work, their cars would be thrown, throw things at cars. Homes were firebombed, their summer houses were firebombed and things, and golf courses were also vandalised and sometimes set on fire. The idea was about targeting men of privilege, trying to get their attention at this cause. Obviously, these were all actions that were, committing crimes. That they were all actions that were not legal. So what were the consequences of these actions? And of course there were consequences. Suffragettes, as we know, were quite often willing to face imprisonment. So they were often sent to prison. They were willing to do that as part of the cause. They basically didn't stop their protest though whilst they were in prison. So that's not where it ended. Whilst women were in prison, they would refuse to eat. They would go on what we call hunger strike. Now, those of you might be thinking, why would they do that? Why would they refuse to eat? Surely that's only them suffering and nobody else. But the idea is if women refused to eat and died in prison, then that would be on the government's hands and it would turn people into martyrs, people that had died for the cause. And the government couldn't have that on their reputation. The government became concerned about this and instead they responded by force feeding women. What this meant is that women were force fed through tubes, particularly forced up their nostrils that would then go down into their throats. And this was a really painful, inhumane experience. So women were force fed through their noses and often held down by multiple people. And this would leave them with bruises and other quite serious injuries in the process. And of course, it was not very good for their mental health because of the experience being quite traumatic. So this was something that was then considered to be really inhumane, and the government's response was criticised by many. However, not everybody sympathised with the suffragettes. There were still lots of groups that opposed what they were doing and didn't sympathise with their actions. So although there was public outcry from many, as the process from the government had been considered inhumane, it didn't get everybody's sympathy. It certainly got a lot of attention for the suffragette campaign. So we've now talked about the suffragettes and what they did. We've talked about one of the leading suffragettes, Emmeline Pankhurst. But now I'd like us to look at a local suffragette. It's important that we recognise that women were not just campaigning in areas such as London. Suffragettes campaigned across the country. Nottingham had its own branch of suffragettes. One of the women was called Helen Watts. I'd like to spend some time reading the information on this slide about Helen Watts and make a judgment about how significant she was in helping the cause. I want you to consider what she did to help raise awareness for the cause and what she sacrificed in order to gain more equal rights for women. So there are two tasks. Essentially, I want you to make some notes about Helen Watts, and I'd also like you to write a paragraph about how significant you think she was. So just to give you a few pointers of some of the things that she did, what actions she took, you could look at things like, for example, her time spent in prison. So on the third bullet point, it talks about how she was imprisoned twice for her activism in 1909. She served time in Holloway, and that was particularly for a demonstration outside of the House of Commons. Even though she was a woman from Nottingham, she did visit London as a way of protesting. She demonstrated outside of a meeting where the MP, Winston Churchill, was due to speak. So she basically took part in protests and was imprisoned sometimes for these peaceful protests as well. And it's important to recognise that. Women weren't always arrested for violent actions, but in some cases were arrested just for peaceful protesting outside of Parliament and did face police brutality for this as well. Another thing that you could look at is the fact that she became a sought-after speaker at meetings and events. She reminded audiences that most suffragettes were ordinary women with ordinary everyday concerns. She raised debates about other issues like low wages, insurance and pensions rights, and also wider gender politics. She wasn't just concerned about getting women the right to vote, but she was also someone that did speeches about the general rights of women, which we know from last lesson were not the same as the rights for men. So she was passionate, she was a strong speaker, and she was somebody that did actually sacrifice time in prison and in some cases was force-fed to basically gain rights for women. So I'd like you to look at this in a bit more detail on your own. Make some notes about Helen Watts. The first thing you will want to do before you start your notes, though, is to do a subheading with her name, Helen Watts, and then make your bullet pointed notes underneath that. Remember that once you've finished your notes, you should go on to task 2, where you answer the question, do you think Helen was significant in helping women to achieve equal voting rights? So at any rate, we've spent the last 2 lessons looking at these 2 groups, suffragists and suffragettes. You should hopefully have made judgments about how successful each one of them was in helping to raise awareness of inequalities regarding women's suffrage. I'd like you now to decide which group you think was more important in helping women to achieve the right to vote. You need to explain your answer in a paragraph, and make sure you use evidence from the notes that you've made over the past 2 lessons. You might want to look back over your notes before you make your judgment to make sure that you've got evidence to support what you think. Now, before you go off and do your paragraph, guys, as this is the last activity of our lesson today, I just want to say well done for all your hard work this week, looking at the rights of women to vote and looking at the work of the suffragists and the suffragettes to gain equality for women. Remember that if you've worked in your book, that's great. But if your book is at school and you've been working on paper, can you please make sure that you keep all of your work on your paper safe? Remember to bring it into school so that we can stick it into your books when you get back. I hope you take care and I hope you've enjoyed this week's lessons. Thank you.